On January 31st of 1996 aired the very last episode of the Dragon Ball Z anime in Japan. This brought an end to an era of the retelling of the Dragon Ball manga in anime form. That was not the end of the Dragon Ball story, however. As we all know, Dragon Ball was a very popular property, and like any company looking to make a profit, Toei Animation seized on an opportunity. Dragon Ball was still going strong even after the ending of both its manga and its anime. The popularity was so much so that Toei Animation had decided to invest in an anime-only Dragon Ball series. This anime-only Dragon Ball series, which would have very little to do with the original creator Akira Toriyama, was called Dragon Ball GT. Grand Touring. And so, the very next week after the last episode of Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT began its debut with much potential and perhaps with new blood injected into it, as Toriyama at that point was very much burnt out creatively. So with Dragon Ball continuing to be an unfaltering pillar of popularity, and with Toei Animation seizing the advantage, what could have possibly have gone wrong? Hello there, beautiful friends from all around the world. I'm going to be your host, Blackenfist, and this will be the Dragon Ball GT review to end all GT reviews. Dragon Ball GT has been discussed in the fandom for a long time, and has had a pretty lackluster or negative reaction throughout the fandom for years. But was this really warranted? After re-watching all of GT, these, I gotta say, are my honest observations and critiques. As a Dragon Ball fan who has just completed his viewing of Dragon Ball Z, going into Dragon Ball GT naturally excites you. As a fan, you want to see how these characters have progressed, how the world has changed, all the differences, and of course as GT begins, it holds all these promises and more. GT starts off hopeful enough with a sparring between Oob and Goku. Makes sense. At the ending of Dragon Ball, Goku did go off to train Oob. To make something even better for a longtime fan, we get introduced to an old-time villain, Emperor Pilaf. Now, as I said many times in my videos, I'm a big fan of Pilaf, but even if I wasn't, I could appreciate having Emperor Pilaf here in the first episode of Dragon Ball GT, and the significance that that makes. He is, of course, the first main villain of the entire franchise, and having him in the first episode of this new anime, which does not have any involvement of the original creator Akira Toriyama, does give you a lot of hope for what's to come in this series, and that perhaps they are taking GT in the right direction. But they quickly, very quickly, ruin this. What Emperor Pilaf is up to is that he is trying to obtain the Black Star Dragon Balls, more powerful Dragon Balls than the originals. These apparently were created when both Kami and Piccolo were united and were the nameless Namek, thus hence the reason they're more powerful. I have no problem with the existence of the Black Star Dragon Balls, even though maybe it wouldn't have made sense how Pilaf could have found out about these balls. I could have excused that. It was what Pilaf did with those Dragon Balls that quite honestly might be the biggest mistake that Dragon Ball GT makes, and I say this because it permeates throughout the entire series. This decision is probably the single biggest thing that led to the downfall of this series, and that is, of course, turning Goku into a kid again. Now, I'm not trying to say I don't like Kid Goku. On the contrary, I absolutely liked Kid Goku and seeing all his adventures and him growing up into a man. In fact, seeing Kid Goku grow up and having all his adventures really made me appreciate the character of Goku, to the point that Goku actually became my second favorite character in the entire series. So I do recognize the importance and significance that Kid Goku brings. But that's just it. Kid Goku was a part of Goku's development. It was a stage. And by turning Goku into a child once again, what you are doing is that you are reverting Goku back to a previous stage in Goku's development. Maybe this would have been more interesting if Goku was turned into a kid, but he retained all the characteristics of an adult Goku, and he retained the development that we had seen him all the adventures and tribulations that he had gone through out his whole life were essentially reversed in this very moment. And that really is the biggest problem with this decision, because Goku is the main character, and what you're essentially doing is reverting your own main character back to a point where he loses the characteristics that he had gained throughout his whole life. By doing this, all the things that we have seen in the past are rendered a little bit less meaningful. They are rendered not as important as they were before, if not outright meaningless, because in this one moment they are all reversed. If they must have had Goku turn back into a child once again, the best way they could have done this is to at least retain all of his adult characteristics, not just his strength, which is the only thing Goku semi-retained throughout the whole years of his development. And that is something that the first arc of GT is doing. It tries to revert back to an earlier time in Dragon Ball, and by no means is trying to revert back to a previous era of Dragon Ball a bad thing, going back to a more lighthearted, adventurous tone. But it was its execution that was at folly. Now, aside from me ranting about Kid Goku, there is also a blatant MacGuffin in Dragon Ball GT. In the very beginning of Dragon Ball GT, it is explained that when a wish is made with the Black Star Dragon Balls, they are scattered throughout the galaxy, and that the planet the wish is made on will explode within a year. Why? Because we need something to get the story rolling, and we couldn't have thought of a better idea. This is the very beginning of GT, and they are already bringing out some of the biggest plot contrivances, the biggest MacGuffins that the entire franchise has ever had, and it isn't a good sign. I understand that Dragon Ball has had these in the past, but never this blatant and never this forced and ungenuine. I could understand that perhaps we wanted to have intergalactic adventures, but the best they thought of was the planet's gonna explode if we don't go out adventuring? This is actually a very big problem with one of the core themes of the first arc. The first arc is all about adventuring. It's all about a lighthearted tone. It's the reason why Goku's a kid again. In one episode's plot, there is a monster that's terrorizing a village. This monster, of course, wants to marry one of the daughters of the village. In order to thwart this monster, they dress up one of the male characters as a woman to trick him in order to lead him back to his lair. Does this sound any bit familiar? That's right, it's the exact same plot of when Oolong was introduced all those years back. Hence again, they are trying very hard to harken back to earlier times. And this is not something that they didn't acknowledge themselves. Even Goku himself acknowledged that the very plan that they were doing didn't work when he tried it. And that's just my question. It didn't work last time, but we're seeing it again. Why are we seeing it again? Well, we gotta harken back to earlier Dragon Ball, so why don't we just do the exact same plot over again? Now I understand, perhaps a kid in 1997 wasn't around in 1986 to watch the original broadcast of Dragon Ball for that episode, and maybe they were thinking that they could bring this plot in a new twist to new fans that perhaps did not experience it. But at the same time, the execution wasn't even as great. The reason the whole gags in the first time around were funny was because, first of all, Toriyama had some legit perverted humor. The humor in GT is just too tame and clean, even by Dragon Ball standards. Thereby, the entertainment value goes down. But I want to go back to the whole planet Earth will explode if we don't adventure. This is a very underlying flaw in the entire arc, in my opinion. The whole arc is supposed to be lighthearted, adventurous, and fun, just like the original. In the original, the adventurers that gathered together to go to the Dragon Balls didn't have anything very much at stake. It wasn't something like, we gotta save the world, we gotta save my parents. It wasn't anything dark like that. Having the whole planet explode puts this dark cloud over this fun and zany adventure that really shouldn't be there. It kind of gives us a conflicting message, and overall makes the arc less fun than the original, which is what they were trying to do. Emulate the original. Another problem that this arc faces is its cast use. This is not just a problem for the first arc, it's a problem throughout GT. Constantly, we see characters getting shafted to focus on a very key select few characters. Now this is something that I wholeheartedly disagree with, and something that actually disappointed me with GT even as a kid. As a kid, I wanted to see how Gohan were doing, Goten, Piccolo, Vegeta, and the very few times we saw that in GT, it was enjoyable. Now I understand Pan had to be a big part of GT as she was the new character, she was the new person in the Sun bloodline, but even she gets shafted at some points by Goku. A Goku who's not even developed to the point that we knew him back in Dragon Ball Z. Case in point, as they're all about to leave for their mission to search for the Dragon Balls, Goten was originally supposed to come with them. Now of course Goten doesn't come with them because of, oh, Goten was on the phone and he accidentally missed the flight before he could make it on. But as I was watching this, I could not help but feel why. Why couldn't Goten go up there? In fact, why couldn't Bulma? Why couldn't Gohan, Videl, more characters? Why couldn't we have a significant portion of the cast go up into space adventuring? Wouldn't this make it more like the original? A huge cast to bring on adventuring. Not to mention that would add diversity to the plot points. When you have Goku, Pan, and Trunks, who are all fighters, yes, they're different, yes, they have different personalities, but on some level, they're more the same when compared to someone like Bulma, who's not a fighter. In a hypothetical situation, if you bring on someone like Bulma into the story of this whole arc, that could change the dynamics. That could make it more like the original, and in a good way. It adds more character interactions between them. We get more chances to see how they've grown, but we don't. We get a very restricted view of how these characters have developed and a very restricted cast pool. Another problem I have with the first arc is its fights. There is a lack of tension in the fights, and that is simply because it feels like a mismatch. We know Goku is insanely strong. He's been training for so long that at this point it's really hard to bring up something against him. This is where clever use of Pan should come into play, and although I will give it to them, they did use Pan in the fights, but bringing along Goku kills the tension in these fights. And the reason I say this is because when Goku jumps in to fight these guys, I'm expecting him to completely wipe the floor with them. They have no chance, and they don't. In the end, they never do have a chance. But they get dragged on far too long. Now, perhaps this is the curse of an informed fan. I'm an informed fan. I know how strong Goku is, so perhaps that's the reason why I feel that they're being dragged along. But I still feel they had an opportunity to use Pan more exclusively in these fights because she is weaker. Story-wise, that is a strength. There's a lot more things that are believable in a struggle against Pan than against Goku. She's a lot more inexperienced. In fact, it would have been much more interesting to see Goku take on a teacher role to Pan. Instead, Goku and Pan are more of a duo when they fight, but obviously an asymmetrical duo because it definitely leans towards Goku. So after much adventuring throughout the galaxy, they come across the villain of the next arc, Baby, which quite honestly had a lot of potential, and this is something that we'll see again and again. GT had a lot of potential. The backstory of Baby provides a lot of potential for a good villain. Baby is the creation of a Tuffle. Now, if you don't know, the Tuffles were the other race of people that were on the planet that the Saiyans occupied. Eventually, they came into a long war where the Saiyans came out victorious and pretty much genocided the entire Tuffle race. Now, making a villain that has connections to the Tuffles brings out incredible potential because just imagine, a lot of the most powerful characters in Dragon Ball are Saiyans or half Saiyans. And of course, because the history of the Saiyans was always in the past, we never focused on the great crimes they committed. But bringing all that stuff to the forefront, into the present, and having it represented in the villain, having a villain that's connected to the Tuffles, the same race that the Saiyans wiped out, and our main characters being Saiyans. In fact, one of our characters was the prince of them and had a pretty typical Saiyan mindset at one point in his life. Having a villain who's connected to the Tuffles brings depth to the villain. It gives him a proper motivation. It gives him a very genuine motivation to hate the Saiyans, to hate our protagonists, to hate the people that we're supposed to be rooting for, and might even make us sympathetic towards his cause. Even more interestingly, he might even be the one thinking he's doing good in the world. He's the one saving everyone else from barbaric savages like the Saiyans who genocided his own people. Were any of these issues brought up in the character of Baby or in this arc at all? Was he a tortured villain trying to avenge his own people, trying to prevent the Saiyans from doing what they did to his own people? Was any of this covered? Absolutely not. Baby is Dragon Ball Villain 101. He is evil because he was created to do evil things. Yes, he acknowledges that the Saiyans wiped his own people out, but then what does he go out and do? He goes out and tries to acquire all the Saiyan bodies. He is so obsessed with getting all the powerful Saiyan bodies to his own. It's almost like he wants to become a Saiyan himself. And I felt like that shouldn't have been the character at all. Not to mention, you just wasted a huge gold mine in a villain. This could have been the deepest villain in the entire Dragon Ball franchise. The backstory of Baby could have been the best written, most sympathetic villain in the entire series. And there are sympathetic villains in Dragon Ball. Hell, some of them become good guys. None of this is taken advantage in the Baby arc. It all goes down to Dragon Ball Plot 101, where Baby and Goku go into a huge brawl until eventually Baby loses. Now granted, the fight was a bit entertaining at points, but this also brings in Super Saiyan 4. Now, I have a hunch that even Toei, or the producers of Dragon Ball GT, recognized that they kind of messed up by turning Goku into a kid, and they wanted to rectify that in some way. Now, I don't know this for sure, but I have a feeling that Super Saiyan 4 was their answer. As we all know, when Goku transforms into a Super Saiyan 4, he goes back into his adult version, which just brings up to my mind, why couldn't they just let him stay as an adult? Now, this is the point in the video where a lot of people want me to comment on the design of Super Saiyan 4. I just gotta say, I really don't hate it as a lot of other people think. I don't have a problem with his hair being black instead of gold. In fact, I actually think that if Super Saiyan 4 did have golden hair, it might look a bit jarring and unnatural. I know that's kind of a weird word to use when you're speaking about this subject. I have really no problem with Super Saiyan 4, and in fact, I quite like how Goku transforms into the Super Saiyan 4, being triggered by familiar bonds and things of the past, making the transformation more emotional than physical, which is, I think, a good way to take the transformation. It's a way to show that this is really a separate transformation than what we have seen in the past. Moving on from that, I want to talk about probably the best episode in all of Dragon Ball GT, and that is what we will call the only filler episode. I find it quite funny that one of the episodes I enjoyed the most was the episode that had nothing to do with Dragon Ball GT's overall plot. It had all to do with the characters just having a day at the World Tournament, everyone, the whole cast, interacting with each other, seeing how they've grown, seeing their development. Not much happening in terms of plot, but for something like this, we didn't need it, especially since the plot seemed like it really didn't want to live up to its potential. This, I think, tells me a lot about Dragon Ball GT, and that is that they had the material to work with to make something great. They already had the characters. As a Dragon Ball fan, I was already hooked in by the characters, and this episode still proved it into me. In the very smack middle of Dragon Ball GT was an episode where the characters just got to be themselves, and I enjoyed it. And just like that, we're halfway through GT. I couldn't get all my thoughts in this video, but don't fear. I will be talking about Super 17 and the Shadow Dragon arc in part 2 of this comprehensive review to end all reviews of Dragon Ball GT. And we'll continue to see how GT drops the ball. So if you want to catch part 2 as soon as it comes out, please subscribe to the channel, as you'll be privy to also all my other great video segments on Dragon Ball. But until next time, guys, I'll be Blackenfist, and I'm out, man. Oh, and by the way, fuck Giru. Most annoying robot in fictional history.